2, 1. Hi, I'm Sarah Skwire with the Online Library of Liberty and the Reading Room blog, and I'm here today with Amy Willis, who is also with the Online Library of Liberty, the Reading Room blog, Econ Log, nearly all of the Liberty Fund websites. And Amy and I thought that with Christmas coming just around the corner, we might spend a little time talking about Charles Dickens and a pair of his Christmas stories. The most famous, The Christmas Carol, and a very little read one called The Chimes. And the reason we thought it might be fun to do this is that at this time of year, if you are an economist or someone who is interested in economics, you are probably thinking about Dickens, writing about Dickens, or being asked an awful lot of questions about Dickens. So, what is it, Amy, with Charles Dickens and Christmas time and economics? What's the big deal?
Well, I mean, Dickens wrote a story, if we're talking about Scrooge, right? I mean, he wrote a story in which you're supposed to hate Scrooge, right? I mean, it seems pretty clear that Dickens is not painting a picture, well, at least at the beginning, right? You're supposed to hate Scrooge. He's not painting a picture of a man that you should admire or that you should love, right? And it seems to be the case that the reason you shouldn't admire him is because he's a businessman. Of course, the story is set at Christmas, and you have all of the backdrop of, no extra time off for Bob Cratchit and no Christmas gifts and parties and all of these kinds of things. So fits right in, I guess, with the time.
Yeah, and so that I think that sort of puts economists back up a bit, which it should. If the message of the story of Christmas Carol is that businessmen are grasping, ghastly old misers like Scrooge, that's a message that I think that economists ought to, come out in a vast army and array against it. Not quite so sure, though. Every time I read Christmas, you know me, right? I'm gonna argue against what everybody thinks is the case, pretty much, no matter what they think.
That's why we make a good team, yeah.
Yeah. And so whenever I read The Christmas Carol, I think it's not so much a question of Scrooge is a businessman and that's bad. I think it's a question of Scrooge is a bad businessman and that's bad.
Okay, so there I'll disagree a little bit insofar as what is it about his business that's bad? I mean, Dickens doesn't paint a picture of him doing anything illegal, right? He's not, I mean, he's a good businessman insofar as he's successful. He's not using any of the money that he's earning through his loan practices for his own ends. I mean, we see that he lives a very sort of Spartan lifestyle. Of course, Cratchit and company are sort of quote unquote forced to follow in that path. But there seems to me nothing in the story about his business practices per se that's bad. He's not a nice person.
Yeah, and I think I should amend what I said. It's not so much that he's a bad businessman; he's a bad man.
Perhaps, yeah.
He's not a good man. He's not a kind man. And I think for Dickens, one of the ways in which we express the kind of people that we are is through the work that we do and the way that we do that work, right? And so I contrast Scrooge with the employer that Scrooge had when he was a young man, Mr. Fezziwig, right? One of the great set pieces of A Christmas Carol is Mr. Fezziwig's Christmas party, right?
Yep.
And that great moment when the apprentices, including young Scrooge, sort of pull down the shutters at night and light up the warehouse and move the tables back, and all this food comes in, and there's music and there's dancing, and Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig, who own the warehouse and are certainly wealthy enough to party with whoever they want to, take their time and their money and thoroughly enjoy spending an evening celebrating with the people who they work with. And there's this great moment when Scrooge is talking about that party with the spirit of Christmas past. The spirit pretends not to think that the party is a very big deal. He says, he's spent only a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is it so much that he deserves this praise? And Scrooge says, it's not that. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or handsome, a pleasure or a toll. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it's impossible to add and count him up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. Right. And I think it's that contrast there between these two ways of being a man doing business, where the heart of the story is, right? It's not the business that's at fault. It's the man that's at fault.
Okay, so I agree with that. And I'm glad you point to the Fezziwig party, which always just makes me happy when I read that part. But I think the real question is, Dickens shows us that Scrooge wasn't always a bad man, right? I mean, that scene is a great example of that, right? Where he thought this was just the greatest thing. Dickens also, in the part with the Ghost of Christmas Past, shows us that he had a very unhappy childhood, right? So we're left thinking that something's happened that changed Scrooge's personality for the worse, right? I mean, who's going to argue with that? And business is sort of just like the symptom of the disease, right? You also have that scene with his fiance, right? Who says, you know, you used to love me, but now you love money and there's no room left for me, right? So what Dickens doesn't tell us is how we got from there to there, right? I mean, how did the sad, unhappy child go to being, you know, the happy and joyful apprentice who appreciates Fezziwig's magnanimity to the Scrooge that we meet at the beginning of the novella?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and it's not there. It's simply not there. And I think the temptation is to read the story as if, well, he goes into business and then it is an inevitable result of the fact that he has gone into business that he turns out to be this kind of person. But I think Fezziwig is there to counter that.
Exactly.
Right? You can do good business and also be a good person. Yep. You can also be a good businessman and a very bad man.
So I do also think it's important, though, that in Dickens' description of Scrooge's business dealings, he's not doing anything, you know, awful, right? I mean, so one of my favorite, so good economists will recognize that there's more to the story than this, right? So one of my favorite pieces on this was written by Dwight Lee, and he makes what I think is a really helpful distinction between mundane and magnanimous morality, right? And he says, look, Scrooge is mundanely moral, right? He's not breaking any laws. He's not cheating people out of money. He's not doing those things. He is paying his employee, right? I mean, presumably he's paying him the marginal product of his labor. You know, should he pay more? You know, I don't know. Should he give him a Christmas bonus? Those are different questions, right? But when people think about, so Scrooge isn't immoral, right? If good or bad is in that sense. But neither is he magnanimous, right? And when people think about morality, they tend to think about this sort of more magnanimous sort, right?
Right. And they especially giving more. Yeah. And especially they think about it that way at Christmas time and in the context of a Christmas story. And this story and also the Chimes take on questions of what is our duty to one another beyond the merely, not merely, beyond sort of the morality of trading within the market. What are our duties insofar as charity and insofar as benevolence and insofar as helping the last and the lost and the least among us? Right. And where do our responsibilities lie for them? And those become fairly pressing questions in both of these stories. And I haven't read, Dickens wrote a slew of long and short Christmas stories, and I haven't read them all, I confess, but I think that those are questions that I would strongly anticipate being really central to most of his Christmas stories, in part because of who Dickens is and what his preoccupations are, but also just in part because that's what one wants to read about at Christmas time, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say Christmas is also the vehicle, right? Because people are thinking about peace on earth and goodwill toward men, right? It's appropriate to set your stories that are highlighting those sorts of questions you just mentioned at that time period, right? I mean, it makes sense. People are paying attention.
So on the charity question, right? When I read Dickens, one of the things that I think is really interesting about Dickens is that he's actually hell on wheels when it comes to publicly provided charity. In both the Christmas Carol and in the Chimes, he is absolutely vicious about things like workhouses, about things like prisons, about poor laws, which he sees as hectoring the poor and forcing them into further poverty and making it impossible for them to do any better. Just absolutely brutal about that, but equally insistent on the responsibility of individuals to do what they can charitably to help those around them and those who need help. And I wonder whether that's something that's going to make another thing that economists could sort of defend in what they see in Dickens.
Oh yeah, I think that's, I mean, I see that very much as well, right? I mean, part of the reason that Scrooge becomes a hero, and again, important that Scrooge is in fact redeemed, right? I mean, he becomes magnanimously moral at the end, and he's like the most loved and popular guy around, right? But that's part of the story. It's not just that he, saves Tiny Tim and makes brings the big turkey for Christmas. He's giving to the poor, right? And the only thing I could fault Dickens on in both of those stories in that regard is, and you can't blame him really, is his Malthusian political economy, right? I mean, the whole idea with these poorhouses and the prisons and well, there's too many people, right? There's a surplus population, and we have to have a way to deal with them. I mean, we now know that, well, that's wrong.
Well, I mean, Scrooge is the one, unredeemed Scrooge is the one who talks about the surplus population and getting rid of it.
More right. So I think in the Chimes.
But that's not something you hear from the good people in the stories, right? This
yeah, that's true. That's true.
This Malthusian point, and I think that's really important. And I think it's one of the tricky things when we try and read literature for economic ideas. You always have to remember to look at who said it, right? Yep. It's not just what got said, right? What can we quote from it, but who said it? Because yep. if Scrooge says it when he's at his worst, right, Dickens is probably not enthusiastically supporting it. And I'm pretty sure that all of the surplus population comments in both the Chimes and in Christmas Carol are from the bad guys.
Yeah, in the Chimes, it's the nobleman, right, who's like having the party, and I just forgot his name because
yeah. And I think, so I think actually Dickens would agree with you, right, that this Malthusian argument is a very dark one and a very grim one.
Yeah.
And one that we shouldn't embrace, and we especially shouldn't embrace it at Christmas time.
Well, yeah, but I'm not sure if he wouldn't have embraced that, right? I mean, his solution, I think, is different than what as you just described, right? He is, I believe you said, hell on wheels with regard to sort of public charity, right? Right. But that private charity, and you see that in the Chimes too, right? I mean, it's a little perverse, right? But you see the members of the aristocracy, who are the ones making these sort of Malthusian claims, also saying that they have a duty to help the poor, right? But that gets messy because they get a little judgy about who they're going to help and who they're not going to help.
Right, and this is one of my favorite parts of the Chimes is when, so people are less familiar with the Chimes. The Chimes centers around sort of a similar kind of a midnight reckoning that Scrooge has for a street porter named Trotty Veck, who makes his money by carrying messages on small packages around the streets of London. He doesn't make a very good living at it, but he's very proud to make it. One of the things I like about the Chimes is how proud Trotty is of his work and how much pleasure he takes in it. One of my other favorite moments is when Trotty is sitting on the steps of a church, I think, and his daughter has just brought him his dinner, which is a steaming plate of stewed tripe and three sort of an alderman and an economist and a politician of some sort who are friends come walking by, and they sort of circle around poor Trotty, who's just trying to eat his dinner, right, and tell him all of the reasons that he should be ashamed to be eating tripe for dinner on the steps of the cathedral, right? Yep. And most of it has to do with an inefficient use of resources. Right? Tripe doesn't have enough food value. He should just be embarrassed to be eating it, right? And poor Trotty, who spent the 40 pages up to this moment in the book eagerly anticipating his dinner, acknowledging that a lot of days dinner time comes and dinner does not come with it.
Yep.
All of his pleasure is destroyed.
Yeah, this was a feast for him. I mean, this was
Right.
not just, this wasn't your PBJ snack on the, on the way by you, right?
Right. And so they all come and they start giving advice and they start getting criticism, and the plans and the pleasures of the poor are completely overridden. And one of the things that the chimes say, so Trotty's vision is not led by ghosts, but by the spirits of the bells in the cathedral. And I'm looking for the moment when he says, basically, one of the things that the chimes say that Trotty has done wrong is to despair and to think that the plans of the poor and the impoverished don't mean anything, don't have any weight, because his plans for dinner, his daughter's plans for marriage, all of these little, not earth-shattering, but important to them plans that his family had been making have been completely overturned in the course of the story. And Trotty despairs and thinks that that means that no one cares and that his plans don't matter. And the chimes sort of ring out and say, even the smallest people's plans matter. I think that's really important. And I think a same moment like that happens at the end of the Christmas Carol, right? Because one of the things that Scrooge says to Bob Cratchit is at the end of the story is, he provides dinner and whatever, and lots of drinks and parties, whatever. And then he says to Bob Cratchit, come by tomorrow and let's sit down and talk about your plans and talk about the best way that I can help your family.
Yep.
Right. And I think that that's the difference between the kind of charity that a lot of the people, the bad guys, or the spoiled nobility and wealthy offer in Dickens stories, and the kind of charity that he praises. And the kind of charity that he praises is the one where you sit down and you get to know somebody and you say, what do you want to do and how can I?
Yep. Yeah. I think that's abundantly clear in the chimes, especially too, right? Because Trotty's other visions are, what happens, or he has the same sort of like alternate visions of the future that Scrooge has, and they're very unpleasant. We'll go with, right? And we see how the sort of purported help of the upper classes has resulted in these very tragic outcomes for his daughter, for his son-in-law to be, for the Mrs. Chadwick, I think, the shopkeeper.
Chicken stalker.
Right. How did I get that wrong? Chicken stalker. I should remember that. But anyway, you see the effects of when choices are imposed upon them by others, even in the name of, help or goodwill, things go really badly awry.
Right. These are really, these are incredibly dark stories.
Yeah. I actually think the Chimes is much darker.
The Chimes is much, much darker than Christmas Carol, and even the sort of the celebration at the end, which is a genuine celebration, right? In Christmas Carol, you got sort of this magical kind of abundance, right? Yep. Scrooge suddenly decides that he's just going to spend all of this money on everybody, yep. And there's a goose that's bigger than Tiny Tim, and the table is full, and there's just wealth sort of flowing out in kind of a fairy tale fashion from Scrooge, which is cool and fun. Yep. Chimes has a much more sort of realistic ending where Trotty gets the very kind of small scale celebration that he had greatly been looking forward to, and that is as important to him as any kind of big celebration. Right? Yep. And that's, now that I think of it, that's another really interesting thing about these stories, right? Dickens himself, right? He talks about the importance of the plans of the poor, right? And of the pleasures of the poor, and not interrupting those. And it may be worth noting, right, that Trotty gets back his original celebration that he'd been planning on. And we also see what the Cratchits' Christmas dinner would have been like without Scrooge's intervention, right? Because Scrooge visits that with the ghost of Christmas present, right? Yep. And, there's not a lot of food. The Christmas pudding is very small. The goose is very small. But there's a lot of love there, and there's a lot of joy there, and there's a lot of kindness there. And I don't, it takes us back to that Fezziwig thing. You only spent X amount of pounds on it. How can it be worth that much? And Scrooge says it's not, in this case, it's not the money that you spend, it's the doing it at all, right? And the Cratchit Christmas is certainly, everybody eats a lot better when Scrooge puts in for the feast, and that's good. And there's more pleasure because Scrooge has joined and everyone is pleased to see him redeemed and improved, right? But the Cratchits were going to have, you know, a happy Christmas. They were going to make themselves a happy Christmas regardless.
Yeah, so one point that might suggest something different is the point about Tiny Tim, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I agree with everything you said, right? And I think that individual agency on the part of all the characters is a really important piece for Dickens. And that, you know, by and large, it's not the wealth, it's, you know, what you do for other people. But we know that Tiny Tim would die.
Yes.
And that's a big point in favor of Dickens' more sort of political / charitable outlook, right? I mean,
Yes.
without the wealth, Tiny Tim dies, right? So yes, there was joy that Christmas, but we know that he won't be there on the following Christmas.
Right. There's stuff that money can absolutely do and fix. And when it can, it probably should, I think, is where Dickens is taking us. But then there's also stuff that you can't put love and kindness in. Money is not a love and kindness substitute, right?
Right.
It can, however, buy medicine and better doctors and keep children alive. I think Tiny Tim is also a good argument against the notion that there's a Malthusian kind of point of view being promoted in these stories, right? A Tiny Tim is nothing if not surplus population when we first meet him.
Yeah.
He's a poor, crippled child who can't work.
Yeah.
I mean, I do not believe that such people are surplus population, but the Malthusians.
To be clear, yeah.
I just want
to think that, yeah.
I worry when I say these things on video, right?
I know, right?
So which story do you think economists should read or assign or like better?
Oh,
that's a good question, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, so I confess, I just recently read the Chimes.
Right, because I made you.
In preparation to have this conversation. Yes, aka you made me. I had in fact read A Christmas Carol several times before. So I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say I think that most of them just haven't read the Chimes.
Yeah, nobody's read the Chimes.
Okay,
for
so
a very
it's
long
not just
time.
scratchy economists, it's everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, good news. Good news, economists. You're not alone. I mean, A Christmas Carol is just such a part of popular culture that, you know, in that respect, I would say yes, because like everybody knows the story, right? I mean, and think of how many retellings there have been of that, right? There's like a Disney Christmas Carol, there's a Muppets Christmas Carol, there's there's the, oh well, Scrooge McDuck, he's Disney. There's you know the Bill Murray Christmas Carol, like there's so many. There's Jim Carrey Christmas Carol. So everybody knows the story. So there's some value, I think, in that, and using the sort of familiar and tying into, you know, cultural literacy sorts of moments.
Yeah.
And I do think maybe the last point that you made is one of the more important ones, right? I mean, there is a greater role for financial security and wealth in A Christmas Carol than there is in the Chimes. And, you know, economists know, right? Like we've modeled that money can't buy happiness, but it does go part of the way, right? Like
yeah,
there's after a certain point of income, your marginal happiness doesn't increase, right?
Right.
But if you have to worry about healthcare and food on the table, money really can make a big difference, right?
Right.
And I think there's a little bit more to say about the sort of private provision of charity in A Christmas Carol than there is in the Chimes. The Chimes is a little more bashing on the aristocracy, which, you know, like I'm down with that. But I just, you know, it's maybe a little less contemporary. I think The Christmas Carol is a more timeless tale.
Yeah, I think that you are probably right about that. I think they make a nice pair.
Oh yeah, well, you didn't tell me that I could choose both. That wasn't one of the options.
Right. No, I know. That's because that's what I was going to pick.
Oh,
I think,
So
I mean, I
you
think
picked
they
me, yeah.
make a nice pair. I think A Christmas Carol is more widely read in part because it's part of the popular culture the way that
Yep.
it is. I also, frankly, I think it's, you can't beat the ghosts appearing and I just think it's sort of Dickens at his best in
Yeah.
a way that the Chimes isn't.
Yeah.
Even moderately good Dickens is pretty darn good. So it's well worth a read.
Oh, for sure.
But I think Christmas Carol probably edges it out in terms of,
Yeah.
of literary excellence.
I mean, I think they're great. I'm going to read the Cricket on the Hearth tonight.
Yeah,
That's the
I
next
think
one.
I might be doing the same thing. So stay tuned next year.
Crickets next year.
We'll have
Yeah.
Cricket on the Hearth. All right. Thank you so much for the conversation, Amy. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Sarah. It's always fun talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And happy Christmas and God bless us, everyone.
Indeed. Bye.
Bye.